Hello, welcome Dog fans. Welcome to DawgDial. This is our week 11 of the 2017 season of DawgDial, your weekly radio show all about Georgia Bulldogs sports. I am your host, Josh Mendlinger, with my partner, Joel Taco Thompson. Here we are broadcasting on a network of radio stations on Facebook Live from Buffalo's Cafe in Woodstock, Georgia on Highway 92. So, whenever you get a chance, come on out to Buffalo's Cafe. But first, let's get right into it. Taco, we need to talk about that game this weekend.
Rough day.
Yes, it was. It sure was for your Georgia Bulldogs.
Jordan
falling in a somewhat of a smackdown, I guess one could say.
Yes.
Falling to the Auburn Tigers out in Auburn, Alabama, 17-40 or 40-17, depends how you want to say it. But either way, the Dogs, number one Bulldogs, go down in a difficult game. We will get into that. Much ado to talk about and to assess as to what they can do for the next two games. Two more games going into the rest of the remainder of the regular season. And, of course, they've already clinched the SEC East title, so they definitely have a third game in the cards or on the schedule, in the works, Taco, but it certainly was not a great day.
Still a lot of football left here. I mean, you can see 3 games, of course, a bowl, and then after the season and after the championship. But, yeah, Georgia still got some work to do. Got to lick the wounds on this one. We'll talk about it and recap what happened at Jordan-Hare in Auburn.
You bet.
And analyze that a little bit and give you some more Georgia Bulldog insight.
You got it, as we always do here on DawgDial, your weekly Georgia Bulldogs football coverage show. So please stick with us here on Facebook Live as well as on our podcast, weekly podcast. We'll be right back on DawgDial. Go Dogs. All right. Ready to get into it? Here we go.
Let's do it.
Okay. All right, welcome back to DawgDial. I'm your host, Josh Mendlinger, with Taco Thompson. Taco, we need to talk right away about this loss. Unfortunate loss by the Georgia Bulldogs. It was a tough game, tough day. Started off tremendously well with an opening drive, taking it all the way down to the house for the Georgia Bulldogs on a great catch to start on the sidelines to start that game. And then
a few passes.
Passes.
First drive
It looked like
Dogs.
the passes. Looks like the game plan was to come out passing and not just rely on that running game that has taken the Bulldogs this far in the season. However, after the Nick Chubb touchdown in the first quarter, that was about all she wrote as far as the running game.
All she wrote, Georgia could muster that first drive, and then they handed over the keys to Auburn.
That is a good way to put it.
Boy, there was a lot going wrong for the Bulldogs on this day in Auburn. You know, some of the keys that I think, and we talked about this last show, is that Auburn needed to come out and stop the Georgia run. Well, you can check that off. If I look at the stats here, I mean, both Michelle and Chubb were held, and total Georgia rushing yardage was 46 after the sacks.
Right.
So Auburn definitely, their defensive line and the up front personnel basically stuffed the Georgia players. I also thought that Auburn had some very good play calling. They were keeping Georgia off balance. If you noticed, Auburn has that up-tempo offense. So I think that was a little wrinkle in there that maybe the Bulldogs hadn't seen. The other impressed me was the play of the running back for Auburn, Johnson, who was a powerful back, and they would get it to him. And unfortunately for Georgia, he was able to hit it outside. He was hitting inside. He had really good moves. I think that part of the game plan was good for Auburn. Absolutely.
However, we also gave them a lot of extra yards. There was a lot of arm tackling going on. Not a lot of sound tackling going throughout the entire game. Even after a halftime adjustment, they certainly didn't come out and start wrapping up and taking their players down. That running back had basically free will.
Yeah, it was, a combination of the pass and run loosened up Georgia there a little bit, I think, and had them somewhat off guard. And, yeah, you're right. Saw a few missed tackles. There were mistakes in this game. Probably not as disciplined as the Georgia team that you've seen go 9-0. And so the defensive front, so the other thing to talk about is Auburn establishing its run game. Well, they did that. Auburn had a good run game against Georgia. Whenever you have a good balance, and you look at what Auburn did is on many of their drives, unlike Georgia, they had sustained drives and they came away with points. Excellent field goal kicker, so I think he had 4 in the game, so he was 100% of the game. So every time Auburn had the ball, they were taking advantage of it. Not to mention, we can get into this a little bit later, some of the mistakes, some of the penalties,
yes,
and a couple of ill-fated errors by the Bulldogs. So,
and a few calls that didn't bounce the Bulldog way either. There were a couple there that I noticed, and Bulldog Nation did too, that coulda, shoulda, woulda, but you can't rely on that. You can't let the referees control the game for you. You got to take it over yourselves.
Yeah, and you can't give the other team 500 yards. I think that's close to 500 yards on offense that the Bulldogs gave up. That's about 240 more than their average. Georgia's rushing yards were 237, or Auburn's rushing 237 to Georgia's 46. The other thing defensively, what Auburn was able to do is they were able to put some pressure on Fromm, 4 sacks in the game against Fromm. So, and out there you saw some of the Georgia offensive linemen. You had 5 players to block 4, and you maybe saw some standing around, but they were penetrating in the backfield on the pass rush, and so when this was the game that people wanted to see. Okay, what happens when you put it in Fromm's hand? What's it going to look like? What's a Georgia team going to look like when you put it in Jake Fromm's hands? Well, what it looked like in this game was Jake Fromm really didn't have time to throw the ball when given that opportunity.
He certainly didn't. If you look at what he did with it, what happens when you put it in his hands, if you can go right off the top, the opening drive, I think he showed that he can control the game and manage a passing game as well as a running game. And that whether or not that was sustainable became the question because the offensive line was not getting their blocks done.
It was a tough night. I mean, it looked like the Georgia of 2016, to be quite honest, the way that the defensive was getting in the backfield, pressuring the quarterback. If you stop Georgia's run, okay, they're going to go to the pass. Well, you've got a pass defense from Auburn that was able to get in the backfield, so that's a double whammy. So Georgia really was having a tough night. Fromm finished, with a good 185 yards, through a TD, didn't have any INTs, didn't have any fumbles, showed some toughness back there in the backfield, but he was only 13 of 28. And Georgia was not good at converting on third down, which is traditionally your throwing play. I mean, I'll get the stats on it. We'll talk about it, but the third down conversions was not good. So then Georgia on the night had 6 3-and-outs. So we'll get into play calling a little bit later.
Yeah, next segment.
But I think there's some fans out there that are talking about, okay, well, what is Georgia doing in terms of play calling? Where is this going? So,
well, as a former player that you were, and we can get into this a little bit more as we get going, talk about when we assess the coaching, give them the grades that we normally do between the players and the grades. But as a former player, the offense coordinator, everyone's yelling, Jim Chaney owes bad game planning, bad play calls. But really, it's got to come down to the players executing what he calls. There were a couple of what I thought were some good play calls. It just the execution didn't happen for them.
I think there were plenty of plays. So you have to put this both on the coaching, and coaching is a matter of having a good game plan for the opponent, and then making in-game adjustments with that, and then obviously having your players ready to play.
Sure.
So, yes, that's it. And then absolutely, so the balance is on the players then after that, is the players have to execute the plays. They have to catch the ball. You can't drop the ball. You can't fumble the ball.
You got to pick up your blocks.
You got to block. You got to keep your edge on the defense. The defensive end had a hard time keeping their edge, letting the running backs get outside. Had one blown coverage where they, well, not a blown coverage, but where they hit a deep touchdown pass.
Yes.
And you have to be able to execute on first down, second down, and most importantly, third down. And Georgia's just wasn't getting it done. The average per rush, Chubb was netted 11 out of 27. Sonny Michel, 9 of 21. Coming into the game, we're looking at rushing averages between the two, probably between 6 and 7 yards a rush. So that wasn't there last night. Credit to Auburn, because Auburn's defensive line stepped up and really put a stop to the Georgia running game.
I would agree with you on that one, definitely. The Auburn took it to them and made adjustments as needed. They saw it coming. And that's part of the problem of being that number one target in the country, if you want to call it that. It is difficult once you become the number one rated or the number one ranked team. You become that target, and everyone's looking to expose you. And, bottom line is, this particular time around, unfortunately, Auburn did expose the weaknesses of Georgia. The question is, next week, can they bounce back, learn from this, and the coaches obviously implement a game plan, and the players execute the game plan and adjustments from last week this week? Got to let it go, right?
Got to let it go.
Got to let it go.
Got to put this one away.
Put this one away. Got to have a short memory, kind of like a pitcher, right? And throwing a grand slam. I mean, if you pitch a hit, pitch to a hitter, and he hits a grand slam, you got to keep going. You got to keep moving on.
Keep your grades, though.
Exactly.
We'll grade them in the next segment, but make sure you remember what your grades are.
Okay. Well, I will make my notes in our little break here, and we'll come back after this and give our good, basically the good, the bad, ugly, and our grades for each of the sections on the Georgia Bulldog team. But chin up, Dog Nation. There's 3 more games in the season, and there's a lot of football to be played. So we'll be right back here on DawgDial. Stick with us. All right, welcome back to DawgDial on the CRM Broadcasting Network. We are broadcasting on a network of radio stations and on Facebook Live from Buffalo's Cafe in Woodstock, Georgia, here on Highway 92. Come on down, join the folks here. Great service, servers, great restaurant, great menu, great atmosphere. Come on down. Great place to watch your Georgia Bulldogs on game day. And anything else you want to do down here, come on, John. Great family atmosphere. If you'd like to, please write into us. Join us on DawgDial on Facebook. Feel free to comment during the show. Love to have any input from you about your Georgia Bulldogs that from here on and what your outlook is for the rest of this season. We got
no longer games. Number one Bulldogs.
No, they won't be number one anymore.
We were number one for a couple of weeks.
You know what?
There you go.
And was it expected this season? I don't think so much. So, you know what? It was nice while it lasted, right?
I think preseason, Georgia was 15 to go from 15. We went from 15 to 1 in the, that's the AP poll. Right. So, but, and fell back a little bit after this loss. So it's going to sting. Yes. It's going to hurt. it's going to be painful when you had the undefeated 9-0 looking at you. You knew Auburn was coming in. Not coming in, but us going there. It's an away game. It's a rowdy contest. It's really the first away game where Georgia has seen a large hostile crowd against a major top-ranked opponent. The last one being Notre Dame, but Georgia, brings $40,000. I think it has something to do with the player mentality and the player energy when you have your home crowd there. So I think crowd may have had a little bit to do with it.
Yeah.
But on the field is where it counted. And, grading Georgia and giving out the good, the bad, and the ugly, there's a lot of ugly. Maybe we should reverse it. There's a lot of ugly and a lot of bad. Yeah. And
a lot of ugly, bad, and not a whole lot of good other than I don't think I think we got out of there with minimal injuries or anything like that. If you want to look at that as the good for it. So we'll get into injury reports in a little bit later. But let's go down let's start with the. What do you want to start with?
Let's start with the offense. Offense, yeah, because defense is near and dear to my heart. But offense, boy, we just couldn't get it going. As I mentioned, we had 6 3-and-outs. Our longest run play was 7 yards. The statistics I had here were, with Chubb was 11 carries, 27 yards. Michelle was 9 for 21. And Georgia's offensive line just didn't establish the line of scrimmage. I think I saw some of the Auburn defensive linemen were stunning and shooting the gaps, which is something that you can't expect, and you should have that in the game plan. But they really shut down the Georgia run. So, we're going to get into play calling here a little bit, but you still had a balance between the run and the pass. But when Georgia needed a good 6-7 yard run pickup on a first down or a second down, normally this has been happening throughout the first 9 games of the season. That was rather pedestrian for Georgia to do.
The Tigers came in prepared for that on both up the middle and on covering the ends.
So grading this, you have to say that on the offensive side of the ball, the main issue here was the Georgia offensive line, not only run blocking, but also pass blocking. It's an issue that I know Georgia's going to go back and look at the tape, and they're going to look at ways to figure out how to get this corrected, because a run game this dominant who got stopped, and nobody in the nation, nobody in the world would have expected that it would be Auburn that put the dampers on the Georgia running game.
Not this season.
Pretty dominant, player to player and matchup to matchup. I think the Auburn defensive line matched up really well and was very tough against the Georgia offensive line. So that's where it was won in my book from the offensive line. So offensively, Georgia, and I don't think Fromm played all that bad of a game. I would not give him a big knock for the game that he played. I thought he played rather well. He was fairly tough. He got up from the hits. He took a couple pretty good shots.
He got back up. He didn't appear to be pouting, didn't appear to be mad. He went back, was very businesslike on the sidelines when he would go and get his the calls up to the booth and the scouters. You could see him. He wasn't getting too emotional. He seemed to keep his cool.
Yeah, and I don't think I don't think the game plan was for Fromm to be the hero. You heard that coming into this game that, okay, well, we'll see what happens when Georgia gets down, and then we'll see what happens when Jake Fromm gets in, and we'll get to Easton a little bit. I've read some comments about, well, why not?
Why didn't he come in?
Have the gun in there? Well, because you have your quarterback has to have time to throw the ball. So what you saw is Georgia having to make adjustments in the game where they had rollout passing options. I don't think Fromm is the greatest at throwing on the run. So he was throwing on the run. He was throwing off his back foot a little bit.
Under duress.
Under duress. I think there was 6 hurries in the game, 4 sacks, 6 hurries. And so that begins to affect your psyche mentally in the backfield, but Fromm still made some good throws. He missed the one wide open throw that was just too wide open.
Right.
But that could have been a 6 for the Dawgs. But
and then
still,
the one with the flea flicker play that
the flea flicker got
was
busted.
ready, and he was looking for it, and it was a great.
And it was wide open. So there's 14 points. You can count those all day, but you got to execute.
Yeah.
So that means you got to block. So on total offensively, I think Georgia would give themselves a D.
That's one way to put it.
But shifting over, and you look at this, and here's an even bigger surprise probably, is how Auburn kept Georgia's defense so befuddled all night.
I can agree with that.
Auburn had the running back for Auburn. He had 167 yards, was very workmanlike.
237 for the whole game for all the
for
runs.
total.
Yeah. Compared to rushing yards 46 for Georgia. Does that sound like a Georgia running game?
The stats, when I looked at the stat sheet, they looked opposite. It's just
sure
like, hey, those are Georgia stats.
Something's wrong
putting
with
up
that.
against Georgia.
You got it.
Georgia fell in a lot of defensive categories yesterday in the game, and just giving up some of those that I mentioned. It when you let the running backs get to the outside edge, and then Stidham, the Auburn quarterback, give him credit too. He had some good good weapons, and made several good completions. And so, but defensively, we mentioned that the defense. I don't think the defensive backfield played all that bad. That's not the Georgia team that you're used to seeing in these first 9 games. Up front, in the trenches where it happens, and in the linebacking crew, I don't think you saw that shutdown power
like
that
the Notre
Georgia,
Dame game,
like the Notre Dame
game,
and pretty much every other game.
Absolutely,
yeah. So that was non-existent. So the defense is not getting a great grade this weekend either. Special teams, a little credit to the special teams. Our return game was here, with the exception of the fumble
punt return.
Fumble punt return. Probably should have stayed away from that one. But Hardman was had a busy all-purpose game. I think it was his best of the season. I think close to 200 yards all-purpose on kick returns, but it ended up for naught. And we had one missed field goal, 42. Blankenship made one, missed one. So even special teams is on a C grade.
And that huge penalty on the third and super long, and I guess you could call it a leaping, practically. I guess the old terminology for it, but that leaping penalty on number 50 was that DeAndre Walker that jumped up and basically gave the ball right back to Auburn with a first down, plus 15 yards from the spot, and basically they went down and scored right from there. So it wasn't a turnover, but those are basic turnovers. Those are equal to turnovers when you miss a field goal and you have a kind of a stupid penalty like that.
And drive stoppers. There was some, and this will be mentioned, there was some lack of discipline that was mentioned about this Georgia team in the game Saturday. It lacked discipline. There were penalties, and there were some errors, whether it be missed tackles, out of position, missed blocking assignments maybe. It looked like what was happening out there. So when you have – and it wasn't a turnover game, so you can't blame turnovers. Auburn had +1.
Right.
And so Georgia still had plenty of opportunities to be in the game.
Yes,
but yeah, the discipline, the leadership, and bothersome was some of the penalties that were really just shouldn't have happened. It doesn't look like this is the Georgia team of 2017.
It did. It did not look like a Kirby Smart team. I will agree with you. It looked like the Kirby Smart team from last year, not the 2017 season that was going on. And that's hard to take. Many of the Dog Nation fans are disappointed. They felt that they were let down. They thought this steamroller of a team was going to run the table. In fact, all of us at the beginning of the season, preseason, thought that was possible. We did know there were some stumbling blocks that could happen. But you know what? The season's not over. The season is far from over. There's a lot of football left. There are some opportunities. Some people are saying they're done. Well, you know what? If you go in with only one loss that SEC game, and you end up playing either Auburn again or Alabama, and you win that game, you're back in the hunt for those 4 spots.
Yep. And, I think honest man-to-man that Georgia will tell you that Auburn was the better team Saturday. They just man-to-man executed better, had a good game plan for Georgia, kept them off balance. They stopped the run. They put pressure on the quarterback, and they were effective running and passing the ball. And, by the way, a field goal kicker who can probably cited by the NFL, if not already, he's an ace.
Yes.
So if you thought this thing was going to come down to a field goal, then their field goal kicker kept them in on several drives and put points on the board. That's demoralizing. That's a momentum gain for Auburn.
That it is. I would agree with you on that. We can get back into that in our next segment a little bit. We'll take a short break here on the CRM Sports Network, and we will be right back on Facebook Live as well with DawgDial. So, folks, stick with us. We'll be right back. All right, welcome back to DawgDial on the CRM Sports Network. We are broadcasting again from Buffalo's Cafe in Woodstock, Georgia. I am your host, Josh Mendlinger, with Taco Thompson. Taco, we got to talk and give a grade now to the coaches for the Georgia Bulldogs during this Auburn game. Now, throughout the course of the season, we've been giving them very high grades. They've done really well. They've had great game planning. They've had their players execute well. They've been having discipline on the field, off the field as well. Ran into something, I don't know exactly what, but it certainly was a big wall, a War Eagle wall or something that happened down there on the plains. So, Taco, what kind of grade are you going to give these coaches, in all fairness to the way the players executed, but what kind of grade do you give to these coaches?
Well, you grade them on preparation. You grade them on the development of players, and of course the end game. You got to put the kids in the right spots, and you also have to make the right adjustments in game. So. And there's sideline coaching, there's the bot coaching, there's a lot of other elements to this game. But I'll tell you, Saturday it just looked like Georgia was on their heels a lot of the game. And I say that defensively, but I also say that offensively. And so I don't have any good grades to hand out for the coaching staff on either side of the ball. I think they would self-admittedly, and Coach Smart said at the end of the game, this one's on me. And, the problem is a lot of Georgia fans, really don't want to hear that. Hey, it's on me. We know it's on you. Let's get to the root of it. This is like the Georgia of old. Let's don't go back to that. Hey, we slid. We should have won this game, and let that one game get away. We don't want that mentality. So it's important now for the coaches to go back in and assess the damage. You saw some of the players on the sidelines look relatively demoralized from this victory. So there's a psychological component here that really kicks in going forward. So having them ready to play, they looked ready to play when they came out on that first drive and executed well and put it in on Auburn's first possession. I believe it was a 3 and out. So they looked ready to play, and somewhere in the midst of that first quarter, second quarter, the momentum shifted, and at halftime, whether or not there were any adjustments made, the momentum continued in Auburn's side for the duration of the game, regardless of the last touchdown play.
Penalties that were unneeded stops momentum. A tough play or two. That one play that was not called a defensive or pass interference when they literally threw our player out of the playing field into the sideline. How that was not called, unbelievable that they didn't call that a penalty and give a first down to Georgia. Instead, I believe that was a third down play, and it becomes another 3 and out shortly thereafter. And just draining of the momentum, draining of the spirits of the Bulldogs on the sidelines. And it showed. It certainly, this was the first time they've had such opposition that they couldn't control.
Well, Gus Malzahn put on a good show, and that was a well-coached game. So flip it to the opponent. Sometimes your opponent outsmarts you, and sometimes the players outplay you. So I think Saturday, a little bit of both happened. Auburn, I thought, had a really good game plan. They threw in some twists on the offensive side. They were not afraid to mix it up a little bit. They were going to open up the game, and like I say, they executed up front on their blocking schemes and had a plan for this Georgia defense. So they had the number because they haven't looked at the possession chart for Auburn, but I can tell you what the Georgia plays look like. There were 6 3 and outs. There are 13 total possessions for Georgia, and you look in here and you see punt. There's
That's never a good thing.
There's a couple of sacks that killed a couple of drives. So if you're looking at it, you have 12 to 15 drives in a game, and you have to capitalize and you have to get that momentum, especially in the early part of the game. And Georgia just couldn't get that done. In the second quarter is really where a momentum shift happened, where in the second quarter, or the fourth drive of the game, we were sacked. The fifth drive, we had 3 plays and a punt. On the sixth drive, still in the second quarter, we had a big sack against us. So Auburn was really turning it up in the second quarter. And some people will say on the message boards, well, it's the play calling from the offensive coordinator. And so what they're talking about is Georgia has played successfully, I might add, through 9 games with a fairly vanilla offense. Chubb in, Chubb left, Sony right, and throw a back shoulder pass over to Wims, and that's been working for 9 games. Well, what happens when it doesn't work? And so, when you talk about play calling, Georgia could, at its option, throw out any number of things when you have your passing and your defensive play stopped, like toss sweeps. There's some talk about not enough throws over the middle, use more play action versus drop back pass, try to get the runners to the outside. What about having a sweep instead of running it up the gut all the time? How about some screens? Utilize backs more for short throw passes. What about draw plays? Tight ends are not in existence. So in a win, you don't hear about any of those things. But here we are and reflecting, and the fan base is reflecting on, okay, well, let's look at this Georgia play calling, and let's see. That's the offensive side of the ball. On the defensive side of the ball, Auburn had 30 unanswered points, and most of those were second and third quarter. So there should have been some adjustments there on defense as well to contain the running back. He ran it for 32 times. The guy was all over the field. So adjustments, talking back about play calling and adjustments, I think Georgia got out coached Saturday. That's as simple as that.
That's and it translated directly to the field. Even in the in the post-game wrap-up and post-game interviews, Coach Smart even said that they basically, the Auburn team took it to them, and they were outplayed. There's no doubt. There's a strong team, and it's not like they went up against a much lesser team. It wasn't like it was going to be a cupcake game, and they just gave it up and dropped the ball. They certainly played a strong opponent in Auburn. And the Eagles, the War Eagles, or the Auburn Tigers, whichever they want to call themselves at times, they're going to be a force to be reckoned with. They're going to jump up in the charts. They're going to give the AP poll a run for its money. Not to mention the playoff selection committee coming on Tuesday is going to have quite a change in some of their decisions.
Yeah, and I think we'll talk about the dynamics of that, of a two-loss team. Auburn was a two-loss team, so they were off everybody's radar coming into this game. The losses being against Clemson, and that was a low-scoring game, and the loss against LSU. So, it might have been overlooked here a little bit, but man-to-man on that field, and a lot of coaching aside, there were some Georgia players on that offensive line who got manhandled on Saturday.
Yes, and we'll get into that, the effects on recruiting and everything else that it all trickles down. Because certainly there were some big recruits for Georgia watching that. There were big recruits for Auburn, and players that were probably teeter-tottering going either direction. And hopefully Georgia doesn't have too many losses in that department. There have been a few players for other SEC teams that have decommitted and are reassigning themselves, as one could call it, in the recruiting game. But we'll talk about that in our next segment. We'll get into recruiting and the rest of the schedule against Kentucky and Georgia Tech coming up. And then, of course, the SEC game coming up in December. So stick with us. We'll be right back here on DawgDial, folks. Go Dogs. All right, we're back on DawgDial. Thanks for joining us, Dog Nation, and those here at Buffalo's Cafe in Woodstock, Georgia. Just before we get going into our segment, we'll get into a few things, but just want to mention that DawgDial, CRM Sports Network, part of the CRMSports.com programming, is our flagship radio station, is Real Country Q 92.3 WMOQ FM in Athens and Monroe. For a podcast of today's show or any of the nearly 250 episodes of DawgDial, or actually a little bit more than that now, simply go to iTunes and search for DawgDial in the podcast section. You can also reach out to us on Facebook, part of our Facebook Live broadcasting, as well as by email and Twitter. Our Twitter account at DawgDial, and then our email, georgia@crmsports.com. Feel free to submit your information, questions, and feedback to us here at DawgDial. I'd love to hear from you folks. Love to have you come join us here as well for our live broadcast. Join us here at Buffalo's. Let's get into talking about a little bit of this, the SEC, Taco. There were some big changes in the SEC standing, or I guess you could say now. There's going to be some big changes in the AP polls and the
college football poll
yep. For Tuesday. There's going to be there was a lot of shakeup and losses and some great football being played. away from the Georgia-Auburn game. It was a great game.
That has an impact,
that
though.
has
It has an impact
yes.
for Georgia. So now you get this late in the season, things start to really make a difference. And 2 of the top 4 on the college football went down. Georgia was not the only one that took a beating.
That's
you also
true.
saw the
Irish.
Fighting Irish take a beating, which hurts Georgia a little bit in terms of the strength of schedule and strength of the opponents. But the Irish really took a beating.
By former Bulldog.
Yes.
Coach.
Yes.
Mark Richt.
That's absolutely right.
Congratulations
Miami,
to Mark Richt.
Congrats.
Great guy. Great time here, at Georgia. But, hey, he took it to Notre Dame.
They will be jumping up. Look like the Miami of old. Though I watched a lot of that game, so they really put it on Notre Dame. So Notre Dame's now on the outside looking in on the playoff committee because of the large scale. And you have to look at these games just like the Georgia game. You have to look at the margin of victory is a factor when you're looking at these playoffs. Now,
it's the eye test.
It's definitely the eye test. Here's another game that was big and significant is Alabama, Mississippi State, the other Bulldogs, took Alabama to the fourth quarter. In that contest, it was 14-14 at halftime, so there's an eye test there. How good is Bama? Bama's been unflappable. Bama in that game looked relatively beatable by Mississippi State. Not a bad team, but not one that you would have expect would give Alabama the contest. So, around the other SEC, South Carolina beat Florida, Kentucky over Vanderbilt, Texas A&M out of conference against New Mexico. Missouri put a beat down on our friends at Tennessee, and notably that cost Mr. Jones his job.
Yes.
So we'll say goodbye to Mr. Jones.
Yeah, Mr. Jones and anybody else that's coming in there.
But you mentioned the impact on recruiting. I think I saw it. There's already been talk about decommit from Tennessee. So it does have an impact, and it goes to show that coaching in the SEC is a tough business. Yeah, there's a lot of money out there, and there's a lot of money being made by these coaches, but winning is something you got to do. Coach Jones was there for 5 years. So Georgia in the SEC East now looking at 2 programs, 2 of their rival competitors in the East at Tennessee and Florida, and neither one have a coach. So Georgia fans, after this loss, no worries. We still have life, and we still have hope. We're not looking for a coach. So, whatever you want to call this latest victory, whether it be, or not victory, whatever adjective you want to use, is pathetic, embarrassing, humbling, disappointed, angry, humiliating. No worries, fans. Georgia's 9-1. They've already punched their ticket to the SEC East. Now, what we get into, J-Dawg, is looking at the impact of the Iron Bowl and its impact on the SEC championship. So
it's going to be big. It's going to be a good one to watch. It's going to be definitely something that Georgia fans will be paying attention to.
Well, Georgia's going to fall out in the polls, I would think so, on Tuesday with the college football playoff. People projecting somewhere around 7, 8 where you fall down, and it's going to take a while. It's going to take a few weeks before, after Georgia still has Kentucky and Georgia Tech, and then that December 2nd game on the SEC Championship here in Atlanta.
Yes.
But the Iron Bowl is November the 25th, so I'm sure that's the opponent. So Auburn obviously playing Alabama, and both of those teams have got to be looking at each other. After this game, Auburn has to have a little bit more mojo, and Bama playing a tough game against Mississippi State. That's going to be the ticket to have on November the 25th. And for Georgia fans, that's going to be your opponent.
That's going to be, the winner takes the West, as they say in that, right? At this point is what it's going to come down to. The fact is Georgia will be playing Georgia Tech on that very same day. Georgia will have their hands full with Tech.
In Atlanta.
In Atlanta. They down on the Tech campus downtown. Georgia Tech had a great showing for themselves this past weekend. So that's not going to be a walk-away game. That's for certain on the 25th. And we'll get into the schedule in just a few minutes, too. We'll talk about Kentucky and Georgia Tech a little bit more.
A little bit more shakeup. That's why we play the games. There's a lot of shakeup here amongst the top 10, and Miami shooting up. Alabama's going to be number 1. That's pretty obvious.
Right. Does Miami take it? Are they in the top 4?
Miami's going to be probably in the top 4 just because of the dominating win.
Yes.
I mean, Notre Dame was number 3. Miami is dominated.
Yes.
Notre Dame. I mean, just absolutely dominated. Had 4 turnovers. The turnover chain was out. And so
2
Miami
spots opened up. Basically.
Miami, that's right. Oklahoma's going to be in there. Clemson's going to be in there. So that's probably your top 4. And Georgia, it's no longer the scenario. The scenario a couple of weeks ago was it a possibly could be 2 SEC teams in the mix for the college football playoff. I don't see that playing out. We talked about that off air.
We did.
It'd be difficult to see 2 SEC teams now making it in.
Unless I'm not sure how it would happen or what the committee would say if Alabama goes undefeated up until the SEC game, stomps on Auburn in the Iron Bowl, and then Georgia comes into the SEC championship game and puts a beat down on Auburn or just wins that game. Are they back in it? That'll be the question. That'll be the big question for.
Could Georgia sneak in there as a number 4? Georgia would be the only Alabama, Georgia would be the only scenario that could possibly be at. I think that's slightly still in play. We'll just again play the whole season out. But Oklahoma and Clemson are going to be there. I haven't looked at their schedule to see what they've got coming up. But you're right. But if Auburn beats Bama and Georgia's playing Bama in Atlanta, one of them is probably not going to be in the top 4.
Right.
So that would. So that's why we play all these games and have all these polls, and it's fun to talk about.
It is, it puts a little dynamic into our discussions. We've been talking about win all the way down, and it's been nice to have. It's been nice to discuss a winning season, an undefeated season. However, now I think it certainly allows the Dog Nation to dig deep, get their fingers dirty, digging through all the stats, and actually try to see, what Georgia can do, can't do, how they can bounce back from this. And I think that is important for the Georgia faithful to see how Georgia responds to this loss, to see if they are truly the up-and-coming team that they appear to be for maybe several years, especially having that true freshman quarterback in Jake Fromm.
Absolutely. And it might not be a bad idea to have a little chink in that armor at this space in the season.
A little humble pie.
Georgia has an opportunity to be the SEC champion. If you're the SEC champion, more than likely you are going to be in the college football playoff. Those opportunities are still there. They haven't gone anywhere. They're not going anywhere. Georgia's already locked up the SEC East. So, December the 2nd is still your date. It always has been. There's just a little chink in that armor. So it may just be the chink that Georgia needs to give them that edge. Maybe the players do listen to this rat poison.
Yes.
Maybe they do get caught up in being number 1. Maybe they do get a little overconfident.
Hey, they are 18 to 22-year-olds, right?
They listen. They read the papers. They listen to the media. They watch themselves on the highlights.
Yes,
who wouldn't?
No doubt.
And so a little chink in the armor may not be a bad thing for the Georgia Bulldogs right now.
Not a bad thing. I tell you what, let's take one last break here on DawgDial. We'll be right back, and we'll wrap up our show and talk about the Kentucky Georgia Tech games, what we have to look forward to next week, and how the Bulldogs will bounce back. So stick with us here on DawgDial. Be right back. Go Dogs. All right, welcome back on DawgDial. We are here once again at Buffalo's Cafe in Woodstock, Georgia. I'm your host, Josh Mendlinger, with my partner in crime, Joel Taco Thompson.
Keeping a positive mental focus after a...
Yes, we'll take a little namaste moment, do a little yoga, whatever Kirby Smart and the Bulldogs have to do up in Athens this week, and bounce back. And, of course, getting back between the hedges coming up, bringing Kentucky in is going to be a big, helpful dose of medicine.
Well, the Wildcats are no pushover either. This is one of those where you'd call it a trap game, a game that you overlook. You just lost, the hangover from the loss of Auburn. And, there are certain things that can happen. I will mention this about Kentucky, though. Be careful. That Kentucky coming to town would like to be spoilers as well. Coach Stoops, I read that Coach Stoops just earned himself a few bonuses because he's on a 7-win season. So
wow.
at Kentucky, and Kentucky does have wins against South Carolina, Missouri, Tennessee, and Vanderbilt, and they got a couple of good running backs, so they've got an established running game. The defense is not all that great, but, hey, they're handing out Kentucky's bonuses in Kentucky, and they seem to be pretty happy about their football program.
Well, you know what? They should be. They're holding their own this season.
I thought they were basketball.
There's a lot of issues in basketball right now. Going around in the major program. So, yeah, you're right. They are a basketball team, but they want to be known as a football team, a football school, and they are certainly something we're going to have to look carefully at. Especially if they're wearing those metallic, silver, bluish metallic helmets that they come in with. Those are pretty shiny. Those are distracting.
Pretty shiny. Pretty good uniforms there. Kentucky's
got.
got...
Those in Facebook world who know me, that shiny stuff is distracting.
The Wildcats. Well, it still makes a difference. Georgia still has to play out and play strong. Now it is the eye test. Now it is the competition on the field. So... What doesn't need to happen here in a game against Kentucky or the subsequent game against a rival in Georgia Tech who's come on this past week? That'll be a game to discuss, for the last regular season game of the year. But you still have to play these games out because now it's all about the committee.
Sure.
So it's an interesting dynamic. It's 4-player, and I'll ask you about. We can talk about this. Is what do you think the college football playoff has done now that Georgia is in it? What do you think about the football playoffs and the dynamics that are happening here?
Well, I love that it comes down to a playoff. It's not just a decision who's in the final game, and I think that makes all the difference. Being a big basketball Final Four, the March Madness fan that I have been, that plays well. Do I think they can enlarge the playoffs? I think so. I think it could get even more exciting down the line, and I think it probably will happen in the future. I think they can extend it from 4 to 6 to 8 teams, however, over the couple of years that it'll take to do that. And I think it's just exciting football when it comes down to that because it's not all about the regular season. You still have to come in, and like you said, you still have to play the games, you still have to win the games. So you may make it to the playoffs, but doesn't mean you're automatically in the championship game. And I think that is great for football. I think it's great for college sports overall, and I think it's some of the best time of the year to watch that now.
And what we're seeing here for the few years that it's been installed is it's played out pretty good. There's been some teams that are on the bubble, but Georgia fans here looking at it, they have a direct line and they can see it. Most other teams can't see the direct line to that top 4 team. Some people want to go to 8. I think it's fine at 4, and it's going to be there for a while. Maybe one day we'll go to 8 if they can figure out how to split the money.
Gosh forbid.
Maybe we'll go to 8. But 4, Georgia is the team. They can
share it with me, I guess.
Yeah,
I wouldn't mind that.
It's part of your contract. But Georgia does have a clear line to that. I mean, it's a clear line of sight. Nothing has to happen to somebody else and worry about what's happening. Georgia can play its game, go to the SEC championship, win that game, and it'd be hard-pressed to not have Georgia in one of those 4 playoff spots.
Well, that is for certain. And it also comes down to the fact that who they're playing. I mean, you're playing other SEC teams that are great competition, no matter what year it is, and no matter what team you're playing, you always have to have some concern and game plan for every team. There are no gimme games in the SEC.
And it's the same with the Big Ten. The Big Ten's interesting because you've got Wisconsin, who's undefeated. They're one of the 3 undefeateds left, and you see that happening. Oklahoma beat TCU, so Oklahoma is in the driver's seat there for that conference. Notre Dame, a non-conference team, had the opportunity to push out one of the other Power Fives. Clemson's in the driver's seat. They've, of course, got to win the ACC championship, which may not be a pushover anymore. So there's still a lot of football to be played, but the playoffs and having I like the format of having the championships in the conferences, and then that lets the committee, and that's really where some shuffling can go on, but that's really where it's going to all happen at.
Absolutely.
For Georgia fans, you're not looking past Kentucky or Georgia Tech, but you're still looking at Atlanta.
And the SEC has had that championship game for years, right? They've always had it. It's always been there, and some of the other power conferences have learned that. And they said, wow, we have this one extra game, gives our teams an extra look by the committees, by the coaches, by the players, by even just the fans to influence the decision-making going into those final games. And several of the conferences have added a championship game. Some still don't. So, the question is, and then you got, of course, your Notre Dames who don't have any conference. Why should when it comes to the end of the season, unless they are undefeated, do they have the right to argue they should be in this game or not? I mean, obviously it goes to strength of schedule and things like that. But with no championship conference game, hey, everyone else is playing an extra game. Why should they even be allowed in?
They're Notre Dame.
They're Notre Dame. They are Notre Dame.
But it is interesting, and it's playing out. It's interesting to talk about, and
it's fun.
Tuesdays, the show's not that great, but I can promise you this show this week will be a lot more interesting than the show was last week when they start handing out the rankings. So there'll be some changes. It'll be interesting to see how the committee sees it. But as you can see,
the Tuesday night show is what
the Tuesday night show.
Our show here is top notch no matter what, right?
But this will play out, and the conference games are they're gonna throw one more twist into the rankings. So we won't really know. We'll talk about it up till that point. But hey, look, for Georgia fans, we were ranked number 1. See where that got us. Wipe the slate clean. Let's get back to it. Let's play our next 2 games. Let's beat Kentucky and Athens, and let's keep in the back of our head that we got an SEC championship to play for.
Which is the first
in
goal,
Atlanta.
Right? Isn't that the goal at the beginning of the season? Yes, it is a national championship, but hey, you know what? Having bragging rights, winning the SEC outright, winning the SEC East outright, and now going for the full SEC title is a great, great end of a season if you don't get to the national championship game. Second season with Kirby Smart, and you're taking yourself to the championship game for SEC, and with poised to win it even. So can't really complain all that much, Bulldog Nation.
Overall, Bulldog Nation's in a good spot. I like what Coach Smart is doing. This game, let's erase it. And going forward, this is an important dynamic of how does a Georgia team has good senior leadership. We're ranked number 1. How do you formulate that team, get those attitudes gelled back together? Right. The good thing is that Georgia has 2 games to play out through the rest of the season. Surely there are some things on tape that are going to be fixed. Right. But as a Georgia fan, I'm not going to be intimidated whether it's going to be Auburn or Alabama. It's not in your control. No. It's going to be Auburn or Alabama December the 2nd in Georgia. You know that now. And so I'm still on the bandwagon here.
Don't jump off yet, folks. It's still going to be a great season. It's going to be a great ending to the season for all you Dog fans. Stick with us. Stick with your Dogs. And keep cheering them on every Saturday right up until the end, because you never know what's going to happen. That's the beauty of college football, isn't it, Taco?
That's right.
All right. Well, thanks, folks. Thanks for joining us here on Facebook Live. Thanks for joining us to those who are here at Buffalo's Cafe in Woodstock, Georgia. We are going to have to sign off and see you next week on DawgDial. But before we do, just want to remind you folks that the executive producer of DawgDial is John Rawl. Thank you to my co-host Taco Thompson. Special thanks to all our fans here at Buffalo's Cafe. I am Josh Mendlinger. Thank you for listening. DawgDial is a production of CRM Sports. For more info, visit us at crmsports.com. Go Dogs.